Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you a wrap-up of horror and thriller books I've been reading recently, which is perfect now that we are into spooky season. I have books about vampires, demons, and my personal favorite subgenre, possessions, as well as some good thrillers to put on your radar. So if that sounds good, I hope you stick around. Let's get started. Now, starting off with the possession story, I want to talk about The 7 Visitations of Sydney Burgess by Andy Marino. And this is a book that I received for review from Orbit Books. Now, this follows a young woman who, right at the beginning of the story, opens her door to find a masked man is coming in for a home invasion. She fights him off, and in her memory, she escapes. However, her mind goes blank, she blacks out, and when she wakes up, the police tell her a different story. They tell her that she actually murdered the person who was attacking her. And the story goes from there because she begins to question her own memory and slowly have these blackouts that keep recurring, or these visitations that are possibly possession incidents. Now, if you know me, you know that I love a possession story. So I was very excited when I heard about this one because I'm always looking for a new favorite. There's something about the idea of a demon or some kind of presence taking over someone's body and someone just losing control. I always think that these stories have a bit of a psychological aspect to them, so I was very eager to try this one out. And I have to admit that maybe my expectations were a little bit high, but this one did leave me a little bit disappointed. I think my main issue with it is the way that it was narratively structured. So because of the fact that the main character is blacking out, she does not remember certain incidents, or she remembers them differently, the narrative is constantly shifting. And I think that in terms of design, it's a very interesting choice, and I like the author taking a chance on that. But in terms of the execution, I'll be honest, it didn't work. Whenever I found myself getting into the story, suddenly it would stop and they would switch times, and just the story would move in a way that I wasn't expecting, and I just found it very jarring. So in a way, I know the story was intentionally doing that, I just didn't think it worked well. So as a story, I didn't completely connect with this one. I didn't completely connect with the characters. I wanted to love this one so badly. So if you love possession stories as much as I do, you might want to consider trying this one out for yourself regardless. I definitely appreciated parts of the story. I enjoyed the parts that were involving the possessed moments. I thought that those were great with her murderous thoughts. But as a whole, this one just kind of didn't work. It had a lot of great parts to it, but as a whole, it just didn't quite come together for me. Next up, we have Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, and this is a re-release coming out from Tor Nightfire, who provided my review copy. And this is a story set in present-day Mexico, and it follows two characters, one who is a vampire and one who is a little bit of a street rat. They are poor and trying to survive, and so they end up meeting and forming a platonic relationship where they have basically a relationship formed around the fact that they need to rely on each other to survive. They move into the same apartment and find each other to be useful in order to get along in life. Now, this is a book that I've actually previously read, but it was many, many years ago. That was back when I was the co-host for the Books in the Freezer podcast. Highly recommend if you haven't checked it out. But at the time, we were doing our first episode on vampires, and so before the episode, I was frantically reading every single vampire book that I could possibly get my hands on. And I also discovered at that point in time that vampire fiction was not my favorite. It's just not a subgenre of horror that I particularly love. And so when I first read this book, I remember having lukewarm thoughts about it. So I was excited to revisit it now that I've read a lot more horror. And I will say that rereading it, I enjoyed it a lot more. I appreciated a lot more about it. My favorite aspect was definitely the world building surrounding the history of vampires, because in this near future setting, vampires have actually come out. They are not hidden in the darkness, but everyone knows that vampires exist, so they are part of society. And of course, because this one is set in Mexico, it had those cultural elements which I really liked. There is a lot of discussion of Aztec mythology and the origins of the vampires, and the vampires are just part of society, and you get to see how they're part of not only a North American society, but specifically in Mexico. And I really like those elements, but if I had a complaint, I would say that the plot itself is very thin. It's a very character-driven story, and while I appreciated the characters, I never was particularly invested in them. So I definitely like this one more the second time around, and I think that if you like vampire fiction, if you're looking for diverse vampire fiction, this is an excellent one to check out. It's just not going to be a 5-star read for me because it's about vampires, and I don't know if any vampire story is going to be a 5-star all-time favorite just because of the genre. Now, apparently I was on a bit of a rereading kick because after that I picked up Horns by Joe Hill. This follows a young man who wakes up one morning to discover that horns are growing out of his head. And along with this strange incident, there is also the fact that he is able to hear the sinful internal thoughts of other people as they are thinking about terrible things they want to do that they wouldn't necessarily actually speak out in public, but for some reason they just seem to be confessing these dark, sinful thoughts to him. Now, in the town where he lives, he is a very unlikable person. The town people believe that he is responsible for the brutal assault and murder of his girlfriend, and they just don't have the evidence to prove it, but it's kind of considered to be a well-known fact. And so this story is him first trying to figure out what to do with these horns that are growing, what to figure out to do about the fact that everyone is telling him these horrible, horrible things. And then the story is also a larger story of him trying to find out what actually happened to his girlfriend, if he perhaps was not the one responsible. And this again was a reread for me, and I don't like to do a lot of re-reviewing on my channel because I don't want it to be repetitive, but I read this book so many years ago, I want to say it was like 5 or 6 years ago, that I had very little memory of the book itself, and I don't even know if the video where I reviewed it is still live anywhere, so I thought it was definitely time to revisit it. This book also made my top 10 horror books of all time, or at least as of 2020, and the fact that I put it so high on that list, despite the fact that I didn't really remember what it was like reading it as well as I thought I did. So I'm really glad I reread it because it really clarified in my mind what this book is like. So to give warnings here, this book is incredibly vulgar and offensive because of the fact that characters are saying terrible things to the main character. So they are using racial slurs, they are saying fat-phobic things, all kinds of heinous, despicable things that people can think in their own minds were being said out loud. And the book does not shy away from those aspects. So definitely content warnings for a lot of really difficult subject matter. Also because of the murder of his girlfriend, there is sexual assault and of course violence in this book, so be prepared for that. I just found this book to be a very offensive read, and that's not to say that I didn't enjoy those aspects because it also felt very voyeuristic getting to see inside the minds of all these people, because let's be honest, we all have terrible thoughts, we just don't admit to them in public. But I love those aspects to the book. What I liked a little bit less was the larger story around what happened to his girlfriend. I just wasn't as invested in it. I frankly just found the parts involving everyone telling him terrible things just to be so much more funny and fun. So I would have almost preferred this book as a novella and just had it focused on those parts. Overall, it was still really good, but if I'm honest, I thought it was more of a 4-star read, not a 5-star read. So if I were to redo my list of all my top 10 or top 25 horror books, it would probably still be on there, but it would be at a lower ranking. So that's my re-review of Horns. I would recommend it to the right reader. You have to be okay with some very offensive language, but at the same time, it's really funny, and yeah, I had a lot of fun with it. Now, switching over to thrillers, I also read 56 Days by Catherine Ryan Howard, and this is a story that is set in Ireland in 2020 during the current events of those times. And the story specifically follows a couple that meet and start dating right at the beginning of the first lockdown, and so rather than having to cut themselves off from each other, they decide to quickly move in together, and the story follows them over those days. As well, there's also another perspective of the present day where there is a investigative detective who is trying to figure out why there is a murdered person in the house where they were living. And so the story is well structured in the fact that you see this couple coming together, you get to see the beginnings of their relationship, and then you get to see the aftermath and knowing that something goes horribly, horribly wrong. You find out very quickly that everyone has their secrets and it's more complicated than it sounds. I will say that I generally like this one a little more more than I expected to. I'm not someone who's crazy excited about all of this really topical fiction right now, but I'm also someone who's not turned off by it. Compared to other books like, say, False Witness, this one talks about the incidents, but the author doesn't really include their voice or take any kind of political stance. But I will say that I think the strongest part of this book was the mystery around what was happening. I'd like to have the aspects in the present day where you get to see the investigation. But what I struggled with a little bit more was the relationship between the main characters, and it's the fact that in some ways is read a lot more like a contemporary, where it was back and forth about the getting to know you and, you know, how do you share yourself with another person, and that's just not stuff that I personally care about. So I like this one, didn't love it. I thought the ending was all right. It was very quick and easy to fly through. So if you're someone who, again, is really into the fiction that's coming out right now that is oh so topical, you might really enjoy this one. I thought it was decent. It was a book I received via audio thanks to Libro FM, which is an alternative to Audible if you're looking for an audiobook service. So I always have a link down below. Again, liked but didn't love. Check it out for yourself if it sounds up your alley. And finally, we have The Stolen Hours by Alan Eskens. This is a thriller that follows a few different perspectives, one being a attorney prosecutor who is just trying to get on with a new firm, and they're pulled into a case where a woman is found nearly drowned in the water after a terrible assault. And then the story is also told from the perspective of the villainous character who committed the assault and his attempt to try to get away from it. So he sees the police coming, he knows that they're going to suspect him, and the identity of that person is revealed right away. So that's why I define this book as a thriller, not a mystery, is that we know who did it from the start. But he was very smart in how he planned it, and so he was prepared and knows how to destroy evidence and all of that. So what we have is a bit of a cat and mouse setup where you have a detective, or rather in this case, a lawyer who is trying to gather the evidence to make this case and bring this man down who we know is guilty. And then we also get the perspective of him himself trying to cover his tracks. If you know me, one of my favorite tropes in thrillers is getting the perspective of the bad guy, so I really enjoyed this. And if you're not familiar with the author, I've said before that Alan Eskens, in my opinion, is one of the best crime fiction writers out there. I love his books, and partially for the reason that they're all so different than each other. So he has written very classic mysteries, he has written thrillers, legal procedures, all of that, and each one is different. Technically, the characters in this one are characters we have seen before in his previous books, but this one also works completely as a standalone. I thought the character work was wonderful. If you've read his previous work, you will get even more out of the character development in this, but again, you honestly can just start here if you want to try him out. I think this is one of his strongest. I was turning the pages. I thought it was incredibly exciting. The mystery was well plotted because there still is some twists and turns, even though we knew who the bad guy was. And yeah, I just think he is such a good writer. Highly recommend him. I do, of course, review more horror on my channel these days, but this is an author that constantly gets me coming back to the mystery and thriller genres, because if he writes a book, I have to read it, and obviously recommend it to you all. So please go check him out. I think that this is a great place to start, or you could go back to his first book, which is probably my personal favorite, The Life We Bury, which is also amazing. So that's it for this video. I'd love to hear down below of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out? And I'd also love to hear what books you're reading this spooky season, because don't worry, I'm going to be back with even more recommendations as I continue to read and review this fall. If you're new to my channel, consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror and thrillers, as well as adult science fiction and fantasy. And you can help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, sharing it around online, and if you hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.